On May 15, 2020, the tranquil forests of Clallam County, Washington became the site of a grim discovery. A couple from Seattle, on a camping trip, stumbled upon human remains while setting up their campsite. The discovery occurred in a dense forest area roughly 15 miles from the nearest town. The couple was in the process of choosing a spot for their tent when they noticed something unusual partially hidden by vegetation. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was a human bone. Shocked by their find, they immediately called 911. The Clallam County Sheriff's Office promptly dispatched officers to the scene. The lead detective from the Clallam County Sheriff's Office arrived and quickly secured the immediate area. She took preliminary statements from the visibly shaken couple. Recognizing the potential significance of the find, the detective called for additional resources, including forensic experts. A forensic anthropologist was brought to the site to examine the remains. His initial assessment indicated that the bone had been exposed to the elements for a significant period. He estimated that death had occurred at least 10 years prior, possibly longer. Over the next several days, a comprehensive search of the surrounding area was conducted. The search team consisted of officers from the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, volunteers from the local search and rescue team, and cadaver dogs with their handlers. Their efforts yielded additional evidence, more skeletal remains, including a skull, and fragments of weathered clothing. Despite the thorough search, less than 50% of a complete human skeleton was recovered. The forensic anthropologist hypothesized that local wildlife had likely scattered or consumed the missing remains. This incomplete set of remains presented a significant challenge for the investigation, complicating identification efforts. The advanced state of decomposition also made determining the cause and time of death difficult. Furthermore, the large search area with dense vegetation increased the likelihood that some evidence might have been overlooked. The discovery quickly became public knowledge, leading to increased media presence in the area and heightened concern among local residents about safety in the forests. Speculation about potential connections to missing persons cases in the region began to circulate. Given the suspicious nature of the remains' location, the lead detective officially opened a homicide investigation on May 18, 2020. Following the recovery of the remains, a forensic autopsy was conducted to gather more information about the deceased and the circumstances surrounding their death. The autopsy proved to be exceptionally challenging due to the poor preservation of the remains. The body had been significantly decomposed and scattered by wildlife, making a comprehensive analysis difficult. Only fragments of clothing remained, and these yielded no traceable DNA evidence. Many of the bones showed signs of post-mortem damage, likely caused by animal activity. Despite these challenges, the forensic anthropologists were able to determine some key information. The remains were identified as belonging to a female with an estimated age between 30 and 40 years old. All observed fractures on the bones appeared to have occurred after death, likely due to animal activity or environmental factors. The most significant breakthrough in the investigation came from the examination of the skull. Despite the overall poor condition of the remains, the skull still contained intact teeth. This preservation proved crucial, as dental records could be used for identification purposes. Using the dental evidence, investigators were able to establish the identity of the deceased. The remains were identified as belonging to Margo Finn, a 42-year-old woman who had been reported missing some time ago. Further investigation into Margo Finn's background revealed that she had been last seen in the town of Forks. Records indicated that she had committed suicide by jumping from a bridge in that area. The bridge in question, known locally as the Kalawa River Bridge, spans a deep gorge about 5 miles east of Forks. It's a well-known spot in the area, standing approximately 100 feet above the rushing waters of the Kalawa River. The bridge, constructed in the 1960s, has been the site of several tragic incidents over the years. Dense forests line both sides of the gorge with steep rocky slopes leading down to the river below. At the time of Margo's reported suicide, witnesses had come forward stating they saw a woman matching her description standing on the bridge's edge late one evening. However, despite an extensive search of the river and surrounding areas in the days following the report, no body had been recovered. The case had been largely treated as a presumed suicide, with the assumption that Margo's body had been swept away by the river's strong currents. The autopsy findings, combined with the background information on Margo Finn, provided investigators with a clearer picture of the case. However, significant questions remained. How did Margo's remains end up in the forest where they were discovered, given that it was miles away from the Kalawa River Bridge? If she had indeed jumped from the bridge, how did her body travel such a distance without being found during the initial search? The investigation now faced the challenge of piecing together the events that led to Margo's remains being found in this remote location far from where she was last seen alive and from where she had reportedly taken her own life. As the investigation into Margo Finn's death reopened, detectives delved deeper into her background, uncovering a life that was far more complex than initially apparent. Margo was the wife of Jim Finn, a prominent pastor and church leader in Forks. In the community, she was widely regarded as the epitome of virtue, known for her tireless work aiding church members and supporting her husband's ministry. The Finn's church was seen as a collective achievement of both Jim and Margo, a testament to their dedication and faith. On the surface, the Finns appeared to be the perfect Christian family. They had 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. Their wealth was considerable, largely due to their position at the helm of Forks' main church, where the congregation's generous donations ensured financial stability. To outsiders, their life seemed idyllic. However, this facade of perfection began to crumble after the birth of their last child, Jim Jr. Margo started suffering from severe postpartum depression, a condition that proved resistant to treatment. The onset of her depression was swift and severe, manifesting within weeks of Jim Jr.'s birth. What started as mood swings and difficulty bonding with the baby quickly escalated into more serious symptoms. Margo's struggles with postpartum depression were multifaceted and deeply impactful. She experienced persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness, often finding herself unable to get out of bed or tend to her daily responsibilities. Her sleep patterns became erratic. She would either struggle with insomnia or sleep excessively, further disrupting her daily life. Margo's appetite fluctuated dramatically, leading to noticeable weight loss that concerned her family and friends. Despite trying various medications and therapeutic approaches, Margo's mental health continued to deteriorate. The pressure to maintain a facade of perfection, coupled with the internal turmoil she was experiencing, created an unbearable situation. Then, on December 10, 2009, approximately 8 months after Jim Jr.'s birth, Margo vanished from her home without a trace. An intensive 4-day search ensued, ending abruptly when a witness reported seeing a woman resembling Margo standing on the Kalawa River Bridge in Forks. Despite thorough efforts to search the turbulent cold river below, no body was recovered. With no further leads, the case was closed and officially ruled a suicide. The recent discovery of Margo's remains in the woods, miles from the bridge, forced the police to reopen the investigation. This new evidence cast doubt on the original suicide ruling and raised questions about the events surrounding Margo's disappearance. As detectives revisited the case, their attention turned to the witness who had reported seeing Margo on the bridge. This individual, identified as Arthur Pete, a 32-year-old local resident, became the first suspect in the reopened investigation. Arthur Pete's statement had been crucial in closing the original case as a suicide. Now, with new evidence suggesting a different scenario, the police called him in for questioning. The detectives needed to understand why Pete had been on the bridge that night, what exactly he had seen, and whether his account could be corroborated by any other evidence. As Arthur Pete sat in the interrogation room, detectives prepared to unravel the first thread in what was proving to be a complex web of events surrounding Margo Finn's disappearance and death. The questioning of Pete marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, one that promised to shed light on the true circumstances of Margo's fate and potentially uncover secrets long buried in the tight-knit community of Forks. Detective leaned forward, his weathered face etched with concern. "Arthur, we've called you in because some new information has come to light. We need to discuss your previous statement about Margo's suicide." Arthur's face drained of color. He hadn't anticipated this turn of events, fear creeping into his voice. I don't understand." "Let's start from the beginning," female detective interjected, her tone steady. "Why did you lie about seeing Margo's self-abuse?" Arthur's confession came out in snatches, each admission seeming to cause him physical pain. "Oh crap," he said, his voice cracking. As Arthur's story unfolded, he revealed that he had been a parishioner and devoted follower of Pastor Jim Finn. "When Margo disappeared, Jim came to me in a state of despair," Arthur continued, his words coming faster now. He was so upset. He told me that Margo had killed herself, said she'd talked about it before. He begged me to help him, to tell him I saw her on the bridge." Detective's brow furrowed. "And you agreed, just like that?" Arthur nodded, shame evident in his posture. "He said he just wanted it to be over so his kids could sleep at night, and for me to save him, I thought I was helping." The detectives exchanged a glance, alarmed by Arthur's words. "Save him?" Detective pressed. "From what exactly?" Arthur's face crinkled, tears welling in his eyes. From humiliation! Shock registered on both detectives' faces. What are you talking about? Detective demanded. Arthur's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Jim said that Margo saw us kissing together in the confessional. He said he'd take care of everything and all I had to do was tell him about Margo's suicide. He promised we'd keep seeing each other, and I did. The detectives leaned in, their expressions a mix of concern and professional detachment as they delved deeper into Arthur's revelation. We need you to tell us more about this relationship, Arthur, Detective said gently. When did it start? Arthur's eyes glazed over, lost in memories. I knew him from a young age, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He was like a father figure to me, always worried about me, you know. I was even the first to tell him I was gay, Arthur said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. I told him about my first relationships and sex. Jim asked me about it and was so supportive. The detectives exchanged a quick glance, recognizing the grooming behavior Arthur was describing. Arthur's voice quavered as he continued. Then one day when I was 20 years old, after the service when we were alone together, he took me to his office and started kissing me. His eyes welled up with tears. I couldn't say no. That's when it all started. We often sneaked around to be together. His house when his wife was out, his office late at night even. The forest on the edge of town, We were so careful, you have to understand. We thought that no one could possibly catch on. Jim even got us burner phones so our regular ones couldn't be tracked. We'd change our meeting spots constantly, sometimes driving for hours to other towns where nobody knew us. Arthur continued. Jim really wanted to go to a gay party, but he knew he could never do it. He once told me, Arthur, I'll never have the chance to be my real self. I'm doomed to live in pain all my life. It broke my heart to hear him say that. Arthur paused, lost in the memory. So one day we went to a drag queen show in another city. I'll never forget that night. We were so nervous driving there. Jim kept saying, Are you sure about this, Arthur? What if someone recognizes us? Arthur leaned forward, caught up in the retelling. But once we got there, everything changed. I did Jim's makeup myself. He was so nervous, his hands were shaking. I told him, just trust me, Jim. Then I put this fabulous auburn wig on him. Arthur's voice softened, filled with a mix of fondness and sadness. You should have seen him, detectives. When he looked in the mirror, it was like he was seeing himself for the first time. He just whispered, Oh my God, Arthur, is that really me? I've never seen him so happy, Arthur concluded, tears welling in his eyes. For one night, he got to be himself, really, truly himself. The detectives exchanged a glance, the weight of Arthur's story hanging heavy in the air. They knew they were peeling back layers of a complex and deeply human story, one that somehow led to the tragic disappearance of Margo. Arthur, Detective cleared his throat, thank you for sharing that. I know this is difficult, but was it Jim who killed Margo? Arthur's face contorted with a mix of pain and fear. He took a deep, shuddering breath before responding. 11 years ago, late one night, Jim called from a burner phone. He was frantic, saying Margo knew everything. Like I said before, she saw us together, but it was worse than that. She started to blackmail him. Jim told me she was so vile she had installed cameras in their house. She had a video of Jim and me in their bedroom. Arthur paused, swallowing hard before continuing. Jim said Margo was furious. She told him that the next day she would destroy him, his career, his life, everything. The detectives leaned in, sensing they were finally reaching the core of the truth. Jim told me he had a plan, Arthur said, his voice barely audible. He must have prepared for it. I don't even know. I didn't ask. I just did what he asked me to do. Arthur looked up at the detectives, his eyes pleading. I don't know anything else, sir. I swear I never saw Margo again after that day. The room fell silent as the weight of Arthur's confession settled over them. The detectives exchanged a glance, realizing they had just uncovered the motive behind a 11-year-old cold case. The interrogation room fell silent as Jim Finn, once a revered pastor, now a prime suspect, took his seat across from the detectives. Despite the gravity of the situation, Jim appeared resolute, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. As the questioning began, Jim vehemently denied any involvement in Margo's disappearance and death. His voice remained steady, carrying the same authoritative tone that had captivated his congregation for years. The detectives confronted Jim only with part of Pete's testimony. They didn't tell him they knew everything. Jim's response was measured and calculated. As a man of God, Jim stated, his voice tinged with what seemed like genuine sadness, I forgive Pete for his slander. It's clear that his departure from our church left him bitter and jealous. This is nothing more than an attempt to harm me and the community I've built. Throughout the initial phase of the interrogation, Jim appeared calm and cooperative. He answered questions without hesitation, his responses well-crafted and seemingly sincere. However, the detectives, trained to notice even the slightest tells, picked up on a curious habit. Despite his outward composure, Jim frequently rubbed his hands together as if trying to soothe himself. This subtle sign of nervousness did not go unnoticed. The detectives exchanged a knowing glance, recognizing it as a potential crack in Jim's carefully constructed facade. They decided to push further. "What about Pastor Finn and your affair with him?" one detective said, leaning forward. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Jim's calm demeanor evaporated in an instant. His eyes widened and the color drained from his face. For a moment he seemed at a loss for words, his mouth opening and closing without sound. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its previous authority. I think I need to speak with a lawyer," Jim stammered, his hands now visibly shaking. Following Jim Finn's dramatic interrogation, the police turned their attention to his current wife, Kristen Finn. As she entered the interrogation room, Kristen's fear was palpable. Her hands trembled visibly and she seemed to shrink into herself as if trying to disappear. Kristen had been married to Jim for 10 years, their union a subject of controversy within the church community. Their quick remarriage after Margo's disappearance had sparked rumors and outrage, but Jim had deftly managed the situation. He had assured everyone that Kristen was a good Christian who had helped him through the darkest times and that marrying her was a sign of gratitude for her charitable nature. As the questioning began, Kristen's eyes darted nervously around the room, never settling on the detectives for more than a moment. The police pressed hard, their questions becoming increasingly pointed. Kristen's fear intensified with each query, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Suddenly, under the relentless pressure, Kristen's composure shattered. Through choked sobs, she admitted the truth that had been eating away at her for years. We were having an affair," she confessed, her voice trembling, even before Margo disappeared. The detectives exchanged glances, then pressed further, asking if Jim had other affairs. Kristen's fear momentarily gave way to indignation. "No," she insisted, a flash of certainty in her eyes. "No, there was no one else." However, when the detectives revealed Jim's affair with Pete, occurring simultaneously with their own, Kristen's world seemed to explode around her. The color drained from her face, quickly replaced by a burning red as rage began to build within her. "Old pervert!" she screamed. "He never can stop doing these disgusting things. I caught him several times, but he just manipulated me," she said, her voice rising from a whisper to a near shout. "All these affairs, he made me believe. He convinced me that I was the problem." She spat out, her words dripping with venom. "Said he needed all that because I was too modest. Can you believe it? He had the audacity to make me feel guilty, to make me think I wasn't enough." Kristen stood up abruptly, pacing the small interrogation room like a caged animal. "And Margo, oh God, Margo," she said, her voice breaking slightly before hardening again. "He told me he left her for the same reasons. What a fool I've been." As Kristen's angry tirade continued, the detective sat back, allowing her to vent years of pent-up emotions. Her fear was still there, visible in the trembling of her hands and the occasional crack in her voice, but it was now overshadowed by a righteous anger that seemed to give her strength. As the investigation reached its climax, the full extent of Jim Finn's double life came into sharp focus. The detectives had painstakingly pieced together a narrative that painted a disturbing picture of the once revered pastor, revealing a man whose actions were far removed from the Christian ideals he preached. Jim, now cornered, had hired the best lawyers money could buy and steadfastly refused to provide any testimony beyond his initial statements, but his silence did little to stem the tide of evidence against him. The investigation's theory of events revealed a man consumed by his own desires, living a secret life of multiple affairs with his young parishioners. Most shockingly, several male witnesses came forward testifying to having had intimate relationships with Jim. These affairs, some of which had occurred simultaneously, painted a picture of a man whose appetite for forbidden fruit knew no bounds. Jim, ever the manipulator, had initially tried to gaslight Margo, telling her that nobody would believe her accusations. But Margo, determined to uncover the truth, had not been deterred. She had waited, gathering evidence and building her case. The prospect of exposure had filled Jim with despair. He knew that if Margo followed through on her threats, his entire world would crumble. In the tight-knit conservative Christian community he had cultivated, such revelations would be catastrophic. He would lose not just his position and reputation, but also the wealth and power he had amassed over the years. Jim had built his life on a foundation of lies, and he knew that Christian communities rarely forgave such egregious moral failings, especially in their spiritual leaders. The thought of losing his followers, friends, and the adoration he had become accustomed to was unbearable to him. It was this fear, the fear of losing everything he had built, of facing shame and disgrace, that had driven Jim to contemplate the unthinkable. In a twisted attempt to preserve his way of life, he had planned the murder of his wife. The detectives theorized that Jim had switched Margo's postpartum depression medication with strong sedatives, causing her to die from an overdose. Then, in a final act of callousness, he had transported her body to a remote, desolate area of the forest. In a final act of manipulation, Jim had coerced one of his male lovers into providing false testimony about seeing Margo commit suicide. This fabricated eyewitness account had derailed the initial investigation, allowing Jim to maintain his facade for over a decade. As the detectives presented their findings, the portrait that emerged was of a man so entrenched in his own lies, so desperate to maintain his power and position, that he was willing to commit the ultimate sin to protect his secrets. Jim Finn, once seen as a paragon of virtue, now stood revealed as a man driven by lust, greed, and a terrifying capacity for deception. As the trial progressed, Jim's demeanor noticeably changed. The once charismatic pastor appeared deflated, his confident facade crumbling under the weight of the evidence against him. His legal team fought valiantly, trying to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. However, with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that their efforts were in vain. The turning point came during the third week of the trial. The prosecution had just finished presenting a detailed analysis of Jim's movements on the day of Margo's disappearance, corroborated by multiple sources. The evidence was damning, leaving little room for doubt about Jim's involvement in Margo's death. It was at this moment that Jim Finn, facing the very real possibility of a death sentence, made a decision that stunned the courtroom. Through his attorneys, he indicated his desire to change his plea. In a hushed courtroom, Jim Finn stood and, in a voice barely above a whisper, admitted to the murder of his wife, Margo. He confirmed the prosecution's theory in its entirety: the affair, Margo's discovery of it, his fear of losing everything, and the calculated decision to end her life. "I was weak," Jim said, his voice breaking. "I chose my reputation over the life of the woman I had vowed to love and protect. There's no excuse for what I did." In exchange for his full confession and guilty plea, the prosecution agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Jim Finn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led out of the courtroom, the once revered pastor cut a pitiful figure. The community he had led for so long watched in shocked silence, grappling with the reality of his crimes and the web of lies he had woven. The conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure to Margo's family and the community of Forks, but it also left deep scars.